Moran, Liberal Democrat MP for Oxford West and Abingdon. She speaks for the party on foreign affairs and international development. Next to her, making his debut on the show, which I'm slightly horrified at. I don't know why we haven't had you on before. Greg Hands, Conservative Party Chairman and MP for Chelsea and Fulham. To my right, Dr. Charlotte Proudman. She's a veteran of the programme, if I can use that word. Human rights barrister. She's the director of Right to Equality. And Dan Hodges, another veteran of the programme, is a columnist for The Mail on Sunday. So, the number to call if you'd like to put a question to our panel, 0345 6060 973. You can text 84850, and of course you can say, Alexa, send a comment to LBC and put your question that way. And of course you can watch the whole hour on Global Player.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
I'm sure you don't need any hints about what to ask. You can ask about what you like, but you might want to ask about Rishi Sunak denying that he hasn't taken the schools' concrete issue seriously when he was Chancellor. Charities have hit out at a move to make successful asylum seekers leave the government-funded hotels within 7 days rather than 28. And a Red Wall Tory MP calls for a Minister for Men to be created. I'd quite like to hear Charlotte Proudman's views on that one, so I hope that somebody's going to ask that, and we're going to be talking about that after 9 on the programme as well. So let's go to our first question. It's a text question from Jenny in Blackpool. Does the panel think the government has acted decisively about the concrete in schools issue? Layla.
I try and put myself in the position of people who have to make these decisions, and I look at what I know. What I don't understand is how, when they had that first school that had the problem in 2018, there wasn't that precautionary measure taken at that point. Not least because in the interim period, we had the pandemic where lots of kids weren't in school. There was time to do work like that. There was an opportunity to do remedial work. And we remember how construction workers were allowed to work. So they could have done it then. I think the timing of it has been awful. And parents and students going back, first week back, many of them first day at school. For some of them, they've already had huge disruption. I've got a school in my constituency that has been told it might have RAC. It put the survey back into the inbox of the Department for Education on the 14th of July. They have yet to hear from the department at all.
But if they think they might have it, why wouldn't they have automatically got someone to check if they had? Why would that be the responsibility of the government?
Because, well, at that point, they didn't know. So they were waiting on the new guidance. They didn't hear on Friday last week what to do. They didn't hear on Monday. I had to raise it in the House today. And what's happened as a precautionary measure, based on the guidance, is half the school is closed. So 20 classes are out of commission. Years 7, 8 and 9 are on rotation. And quite rightly, parents and students are very upset. And the teachers coming to me head teachers saying, please help me work out what we're meant to do, because it's not as decisive. So the government's doing, I think, a very bad job of convincing people they're on top of this. They absolutely aren't. And the question I had for Gillian Keegan today is, how many other schools are in this position? The reason they can't put in porta cabins and procure all of this stuff is because they don't yet know if they even need it. So they had this timeline that they say, oh, we're doing this quickly, but actually the timing's awful. And the short answer to the question is, I don't think they have been decisive enough insofar as they should have done this earlier.
It's interesting how you started your answer there. So you try and put yourself in the position of the minister, which I think probably everybody should do from time to time. But of course, the timing on this sort of thing, whenever you do it, it's never going to be good, is it?
No.
And I don't know this, I haven't spoken to Gillian Keegan about it. I got the impression that the timing has been dictated by the fact that she thought, well, I can't leave this. If there is something that goes wrong, we're inevitably going to be blamed. So let's get in now, even though it is going to be quite disruptive to a lot of schools. Although, I mean, given it's 134, I think.
Yeah,
so
although
far,
it's 600
but there will be
that
more.
Were identified in the initial tranche, and as of Friday, and I'm sure the number's higher now, only half have had those surveys done. So they're now scrambling. To be fair to Gillian, we've had, 9 education secretaries over the course of this parliament? I mean, part of what's happening here is the general sense of chaos in the Conservative Party, the lack of continuity in these key roles. And I do think, whilst they're mishandling it now, and I do think a bit of humility and, yes, maybe we haven't got this perfectly right. Yes, there's a lot of detail she does know, but there's also potentially some information missing, as my example school shows. I think a bit of humility would go a long way right now.
Greg Hans, there was no humility in that interview with ITV News, was there? In fact, Gillian Keegan seemed to be wanting congratulations for the way she's handled this.
Well, she did apologise for how she ended that interview. But the most important thing, Iain, is that the government has taken charge. The most important thing is that pupils return to school in a safe setting and are allowed to carry on with their education. You know, we saw a lot of disruption of education during the pandemic. It's really important that education continues. It's also really important that we don't be alarmist on this, that actually there are 22,000 schools in this country. The number affected is less than 1%. Of course, that's incredibly important for pupils at those schools. I've got one in my constituency, and for parents, but we have to keep it in proportion and recognise that when the situation changed in terms of the information that was available, the Secretary of State, Gillian Keegan, acted quite properly, quickly and decisively, and was defended very ably at the dispatch box today by Rishi Sunak during Prime Minister's Question Time. The most important thing is to make sure that school children can return as quickly as possible to a safe environment, but we need to keep it also in proportion, Iain. This is less than 1%
fair enough,
schools.
but when they put out social media graphics saying most schools are unaffected by this, it's like to say, well most aircraft don't crash. There's no consolation to the kids and the parents who are being affected. And surely one question that has to be asked is, if this issue was known about, which it clearly was, why wasn't more done maybe at the beginning of the school holidays? So each school would have 6 weeks to then maybe get a surveyor in to sort of check what was going on, and we wouldn't be faced with this issue where literally some schools had 1 day to prepare as to what to do.
Well, the information changed, and that is when the government acted, when the information changed. You're right, Iain.
How did it change and when did it change?
Because the information that came in, for example, from the surveys and some of the evidence, I'm not a technician on this, but the information changed, and when the information changed, that's when Gillian Keegan and the department acted decisively. You're quite right. There's no ideal time for this to happen, but nonetheless, it is better that it happened, you know, if you like, when schools are actually on holiday. I know we're all back now, and there's no ideal time for this. The most important thing is to get children back into school, into a safe environment. I stress that it affects 52 schools have made those mitigation measures. There's 104 known about that are doing mitigation. You know, we're still talking about less than 1% of all schools.
And quite a few of these 130 schools are in Essex. I was looking down the list. There's an incredible number in Essex. I don't know why. I was expecting my old school to be there, but it wasn't. Dan Hodges.
Well, to answer the question, has the government acted decisively? No, but then governments of all persuasions haven't acted decisively on this issue. I mean, this is an issue that, as we now know, dates back to 1994. I think you have to distinguish between what the government's done and what Gillian Keegan's done. I actually have some sympathy with Gillian Keegan in terms of what, you know, her sort of exasperation, because it seems to me quite clearly she's the first education secretary, again, of any persuasion, who's finally decided to grasp this issue, and I do think she deserves some credit for that. But I think there's a broader issue here. I don't think, you know, I heard Greg's sort of relatively eloquent defence there, and talking about keeping this in proportion. I think that's right. I don't think we're going to see schools collapsing around the country, but I think there's a broader political element to this. And I don't know. I don't know if you remember back in sort of like the early 90s, there was a hotel in Scarborough that was situated on the side of a hill, and the cliff it was sitting on got eroded, and eventually the hotel collapsed, and it sort of fell into the sea live on breakfast television. And I think about a week later, it was either, I can't remember what it was. It was like the Queen's speech debate or something. John Smith went through and listed, when he was Labour leader, listed a legacy of like sort of current Tory government failings.
This, yeah.
And he basically, Black Wednesday, whatever. And he came to the end and he said, and is it any surprise that, you know, under this government we now live in a country where hotels fall into the sea? And I remember, I was literally in the chamber, I remember in the gallery watching it, and I'm thinking, it's quite a sort of, it's a silly line because it's not the government's fault. But it just kind of symbolised something. And this is the problem for Greg and the Conservative Party of this. Like I said, schools aren't going to collapse. We're not going to have hundreds of children killed. It just symbolises, I think, a sense that Britain is falling down. There's the small boats, there's the strikes, and I think that is going to be the lasting legacy of the system.
Greg, that's an interesting point, isn't it? Because there does seem to be a growing sense that none of our public services are working, that just the basic things that we've all taken for granted, like kids being able to go to school, they seem to be slightly falling apart, and people naturally hold the government responsible for that.
Well, I don't really agree with that narrative. Actually, I think a lot of our public services are not in perfect shape, but they are improving. In terms of the actual outputs of schools, for example, as the Prime Minister raised today at Prime Minister's Question Time, actually our test results, particularly in maths, for example, are now some of the best in the Western world. That's been really turned around in the last 10 years. So when we look at outputs about what is happening, for example, in our education system, what is happening thanks to the schools reforms introduced by Michael Gove, for example, 10, 12 years ago when we were in coalition.
He was the one that abolished the Building Schools for the Future programme.
Well, the Building Schools for the Future programme, which was, of course, the Liberal Democrat Chief Secretary of the Treasury at the time. But the Building Schools for the Future programme, as the Prime Minister rightly said today, was not good value for money. The National Audit Commission report into the Building Schools for the Future programme, Ed Balls' programme, was not good value for money and didn't produce good outcomes. And that's why the government decided to replace it with a different programme that was much better value for money. So that is, if you like, the history of that issue. The amount of money that's being put into schools' budgets, capital budgets, is on the increase. The number of schools that are being refurbished is about 50 per annum. That's not a bad rate. The Prime Minister, so he was accused of cutting that programme. That's not correct. It has not been cut. But look at the
Department of
outputs
Education, according to Rachel Rees, she gave us the figures in the last hour on the programme. The Department of Education has underspent by £1.4 billion on their capital programme over the last 4 years. Now, that you can say, well, that's only a 7% gap, but £1.4 billion could have rebuilt quite a lot of schools.
Well, we are rebuilding a lot of schools. And obviously government departments, having been a Chief Secretary of the Treasury, government departments quite often overspend each year, 1 year to the next, and then the underspend of the overspend gets rolled forward. It's not necessarily a big significant fact.
I'm sensing Charlotte sort of pouring at the ground, wanting to get in. Charlotte, the floor is yours.
I don't think it matters whether it's 1% of schools or 0.5% of schools that are affected by this. I think the fact that many parents and children, more importantly, are going to have their education disrupted as a result of the concrete chaos after the pandemic and all of the challenges which arose more broadly in the education system is obviously going to have a long-term impact upon children in those schools. And I think one of the bigger issues is perhaps how the government handle this now. And I think suggesting, seeing a level of humility and an apology, a sincere apology, and also a strategy in terms of a way forward to address this issue is what parents will want to hear. And I'm afraid I haven't seen that. I haven't seen anything with the strength of character that one may ordinarily want to see from an education secretary, which I think is extremely disappointing.
Do you think, though, that maybe school leaders, and I'm not just talking about head teachers here, but school governors as well, need to take a little bit more responsibility themselves? If it was in any other sector, say a hospital, for example, I would expect the chief executive of a hospital to regard it as his or her responsibility to make sure that the buildings were sound. And therefore, every few years, you have a surveyor in to check that that's the case. Why is it that schools think that this is entirely the responsibility of central government?
Well, I mean, I think that's a good question. I don't know nearly enough, of course, to comment on that. But from what
go and have a go.
No, well, I mean, from what I read when I was reading earlier this afternoon, there were some school governors that had suggested they were alive to this issue and had attempted to bring it to the attention of the, in quote, powers that be to do something about it, and they either hadn't had a response back.
Well, they are the powers that be.
Well,
they're there to govern the school. Therefore, they say to the head teacher, bring in a surveyor. We understand it'll cost a couple of £1,000s to do so.
Isn't it? It's the money, and it's the fact it's a systemic problem as well.
Okay. Yeah, I was a school governor and was a teacher before I was an MP. We always were looking at this kind of thing and the estate. And actually, most schools, especially now, are carrying you usually have to do a budget for 3 years. If you can't do a balanced budget for 3 years, you have to sort of go in and do a special budget if you can't. And most schools, a lot of schools are now doing that. The school I mentioned is in an in-year deficit. And so when you are in that position, you are scrambling around to work out what is the most urgent thing that needs to happen next. And so unless you have that clear direction from usually the DFE saying that, here's this problem, yes, it is a problem, we're alerting you to a problem, but we're not forcing you to do it. They are looking for the boiler. There are broken windows. We've got schools with water pouring through the roof. They are more sort of immediate, in your face. And this rack stuff is insidious. It's sort of in the walls, and you've got to have a proper surveyor to come and do it. So some schools were, and credit to them. But I'm afraid to say, the governors needed that support and that direction from government, and they didn't get it. And I think it was 2018 that should have started to have been happening. But the wider problem around this is actually about the crumbling school estate.
They sent the email out, I think, sometime in 2022. So schools have had quite a long time. And they must have been alerted to the problem by the form that they had to fill in, which not all of them have done. Greg, we've got to move on, but very quickly.
Well, the government has taken responsibility, and we are waiting for the surveys to come back. That is the right thing to do, and we are taking action to make sure as quickly and safely the children can return to school. I stress again that it's a small number of schools, but it's really...
But there will be more.
It's not going
to stay at 130,
massive significance for those at those schools. I know from the school in my constituency, a very, very high-profile school with a lot of... with a big school, and I know how important it is, but the government has taken responsibility, has taken charge, and is doing the sensible, balanced thing in making sure that we get children back as quickly as possible in a safe environment.
But in the case of my school, they sent it back at the end of the last term. That was the summer. The DFE didn't get back to them. And they were waiting for that guidance about what do we do next, because they filled in a survey. They aren't surveyors themselves. They trusted the department. He was like, okay, we got this. We've sent you the survey. And they didn't get back to them. And now there's this chaos. So, the DFE... I'm afraid to say they're doing some stuff.
Not blaming civil servants, Layla, are you?
No, I'm blaming Gillian Keegan.
Yeah, but Gillian Keegan is frankly not responsible for responding to a survey that went out to 22,000 schools.
No, but when you are sending out a survey like that and then it's coming back with a number of schools saying you might have RAC, at that point it should be, you can as a minister say, right, you get back to them immediately and you get them to do the work over the summer. That was a decision that could have been taken.
Well, it'd be quite interesting to know whether when she was actually alerted to sort of specifics like that. But we shall never, well, maybe we will know at some point, but we're not going to find out on this programme right now. But we will come to more of your calls and texts in just a moment. It's 19 minutes past 8.
LBC.
Bye.
Leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale. Alexa, send a comment to LBC.
21 minutes past 8 on LBC. On the panel tonight, we have the Conservative Party Chairman Greg Hands, Lib Dem Foreign Affairs You do like spokesperson or spokeswoman?
Person.
Don't mind. Person.
Woman.
Okay.
Whatever.
Layla Moran. Dan Hodges is a columnist for The Mail on Sunday, and Dr. Charlotte Proudman is a human rights barrister. Right, let's go to Mark in Gosport. Hello, Mark.
Hi, Ian.
Hi,
My
what would you like to
question
ask?
is, does the panel think Greg Hands' continual parading of that letter is clever politics or a crass attempt to deflect the Tories' dreadful handling of the economy and the growth in borrowing?
Now, far be it from me to jump to Greg Hands' defence here, but you're referring to his last answer about the schools, were you?
Well, no, I wasn't, because I couldn't hear you because I was... No, but that was my... I'm continually looking at Twitter, etc., and Greg Hands sends that letter over Twitter or once a week, twice a week.
So this is the letter that Liam Byrne left for David Laws at the Treasury, saying that there was no money left. People are getting annoyed at this, Greg.
Well, actually, it illustrates a wider point, in my view, which has been a point made, if you like, for me by the bankruptcy yesterday of Birmingham Council, Europe's largest council. What it shows, Ian, is that when Labour are in charge of things, they run them very badly. And they end up with no money.
Hang on a second. You know that the reasons for that bankruptcy are not just to do with Labour's management of that council.
I think it largely is.
There are Tory councils that have also been bankrupted.
When the Tories were in charge too.
Well, it largely relates to legal fees, consultancy fees. It's been a problem. It's been a Labour-run council, I think, for about 10 years. And it illustrates a wider point. Labour runs some quite big authorities in this country, like, for example, London, like, for example, a whole country, Wales, like, for example, Birmingham. And they've been shown time and time again. This is Labour's real Achilles heel. When they run something, they run it back.
Who runs Northamptonshire County Council?
Wokingham.
Who runs Woking Council?
But Birmingham is Europe's largest council. London
it's not just a Labour thing.
The country's largest local authority. Wales is a whole country. These are time and time again. When Labour runs something, they've been shown to run it badly. And Birmingham illustrates that perfectly.
But there are plenty of Labour councils that are run perfectly well. Obviously, Birmingham, because it's so big, is headline news. But you can't sit there and pretend that there haven't been Conservative councils that have also had exactly the same problems and have run out of money and have had to declare themselves bankrupt.
But these I'm talking here, of course, there are other councils as well, and I've been around in politics a long time. I remember my own council, Hammersmith and Fulham. The swap scandal in the 1980s, 1990s has been a whole series of local authorities. But this is a council, Birmingham, that has had problems for a long time. Keir Starmer put in his own chosen person as Birmingham Council leader earlier this year, yet still this is a council which is effectively declaring bankruptcy. And this plays into a wider point, going back to the question about the letter, is that Labour have got a long track record of running things badly, running out of other people's money, which was raised with the Prime Minister today at Prime Minister's Questions by Nicola Richards.
So you must be so embarrassed that public debt in this country under a Conservative government is the highest it's ever been.
Well, debt is coming back under control, and a lot of that rose during the pandemic.
2.5 trillion. When you came into power, it was 800 billion.
Well, it's coming back under control. And actually, when you look at the deficit we inherited in 2010, but the point here is that Labour, and this is really Labour's Achilles heel, Ian, going into next year's election, why people at the moment are not flocking to Keir Starmer is they've got deep suspicions about what a future Labour government would mean for running something like the government. They see how Labour runs London, they see how Labour runs Birmingham,
we can
Wales.
expect to see more of you brandishing Liam Byrne's letter.
Well, look, it's been shown, if you don't mind me saying, that actually a lot of people are well aware of that letter, and most importantly is what it means, the wider significance that Labour run things badly when they're in charge of authority.
Charlotte.
I don't think the Conservative Party run things particularly effectively. I mean, if we look, for example, at legal aid and the problems within the justice system, the criminal justice system, the family justice system, it's on its knees. Courts have closed. There's a significant backlog. Rape victims are waiting 4, even 5 years for their case to get to trial. Rape has become decriminalised with only less than 2,000 convictions, despite 1 in 4 women being raped or sexually assaulted. What on earth is the Conservative Party doing about that? The conviction rates have gone down under your leadership. Violence against women and girls is up I think it's an appalling indictment of the party.
Dan?
Well, again, to answer the question, I mean, is it good politics? Is it bad politics? I mean, it's basically the only politics Greg's got now. I mean, I remember turning up at the 2015 Tory manifesto launch, and the letter was literally like plastered on the wall. It was part of the backdrop to the launch. The reality is, I mean, Greg's again done an eloquent attack on Labour in Birmingham and elsewhere. But the problem is, it kind of feeds into what we were talking about before. There was a period, and we all remember it. There was a period when the Conservatives came into power, where they had a good run, basically saying, "Well, I know things aren't working, but it's kind of Labour's fault, and we inherited this mess, and we're clearing it up." And you can do that for a while as a political party, and you can get some good mileage out of it. And respect to Greg and his party, they have done. But then you cross over, and that's what's happened now. And you're now in a point where people say, "Do you know what? You've been in power 13 years, and you're blaming this person, you're blaming that person, you're blaming the other person. We don't care. We elected you. You're the guys in charge." And I get why you're doing it, Greg. I understand it. It's like this Labour attack line, Labour bankrupted Birmingham. All people are seeing is councils are going bankrupt. So along with schools are collapsing and the trains aren't running and they're not stopping the boats, councils are going bankrupt, and it's all happening on your watch. And the problem the Tories have got now, especially actually with Rishi Sunak, who is like, his pitch is, "I'm the world's greatest project manager. I'm the guy who, I'm not spin, I'm not, blah, blah, blah. I just get things done." People are no longer going to accept, after 13 years in power, rightly or wrongly, excuses for why things aren't happening. They want things to go right. They're not interested in excuses for why things are going wrong.
I mean, I think my view is it's a pathetic excuse. I mean, 13 years.
Well, it might be legit. It might be an entirely legit.
Years,
I mean, in fairness, it might be an entirely legitimate excuse. The point is, there comes a point politically where it doesn't matter anymore.
Yeah, but Charlotte, you don't remember the 1980s because you're too young. The winter of discontent was quoted by the Tories. Bear in mind that was 78, 79. That was quoted by Greg's predecessors like Norman Tebbit would come out with that back at 1988, 1989, 1990. So this is not a new thing.
But if I might, what we're talking about is what's happening today. Actually, Labour have been in charge of Birmingham for 10 years. Labour have been in charge of London for the last 7 years. Labour have been in charge of Wales for the last 25 years.
So you've been in charge of the country for 30 years.
Okay, but what I'm talking about is...
And people are saying...
The point here is where Labour are in charge of something.
But Greg, the point is... And people are saying, look, if you're basically saying now, we've been in charge in 13 years... but we can't deal with these issues because Labour's messing up.
No, I'm not saying...
They're thinking, well, what's the point? What's the
Dan, that isn't when Labour are in charge, they don't run things well. I'm making a very simple, straightforward
And you know what else this day is? It's a year since Liz let us Truss, who, as a result of her cavalier policies, have put hundreds, if not thousands, of pounds on people's mortgage bills. I mean, I'm sorry, we are now at the point where it used to be the case, perhaps, once upon a time, when people might look at the Conservative Party and think, OK, I don't like everything they do, but you can probably trust them with money. I genuinely don't think that the Conservatives, after the debacle of the last year and how people are feeling and what they are having to do to make ends meet, that people can credibly look at the Conservative Party and say that anymore. So I'm sorry, but I think Dan's completely right. They've got nothing left, that they've got to hark back to 13 years ago.
I disagree. That is also out of date. I mean, what we have seen, particularly with the economic data being revised... Are you saying that
people's mortgages haven't gone up?
The economic data being revised is actually the UK is the best performing G7 country in
You're
Europe.
so out of touch, Greg.
No, but that is
that's
last
I've
week's
got to challenge
economic
you.
data.
You are
that is
so out of touch.
You're a year out of date. I'm talking last week's economic revised data.
And I'm talking about the doors I knocked on last week.
Britain is actually the best recovering major economy in Europe.
Greg, you are so out of it.
You try telling that to somebody who rings into this show day after day saying, well, OK, we may be the fastest growing economy. That's the macro side. I'm giving you the micro side. My experience. My mortgage has got... I mean, I'll give you my experience. My mortgage has gone up £1,000 a month. Now, I'm lucky in that I can afford to do that. But if I was on an average salary, I would not be able to
No, I'm sorry, and I think this whole exchange. I'm sorry, Greg. You are so out of touch.
You're a year behind.
You are
Layla.
so out of touch. No, you are.
Quoting
You are
events a year
out.
ago.
You are on a different planet.
I'm talking about a
the
week ago.
experience of people in this country does not bear up to what you're saying. Some sort of revision in past tense.
It's a very important
of
set of
the
revision.
economy. Well, you tell it to my constituents who contact me, who are looking at leaving their houses because they aren't able to afford their mortgage, because they are now going to food banks because they can't afford to put food on the table for their children. I'm sorry. The Conservative Party from top to bottom has lost touch with people and reality.
Mark, see what you've done. Good question. Thank you very much. Let's have some more of them in just a few moments here on Cross Question. It's 8:32, time for the news headlines with Serena Farrow.
Airports and ports have been informed after a terror suspect went on the run from prison. 21-year-old Daniel Abed Khalif had been waiting trial at HMP Wandsworth in London, where he escaped this morning. The Children's Commissioner has told LBC that rebuilding schools as a result of the concrete crisis will take years. It's understood government officials have been discussing the use of temporary classrooms for up to 5 years. And legislation that would end historical prosecutions related to the Troubles has now passed the Commons. The law change, which is opposed by every political party in Northern Ireland, offers limited immunity to some accused of murder. LBC weather mostly dry tonight with a few thundery showers in the west. Some mist and fog along the coast with a low of 9 degrees.
Weekdays from 7 a.m.
I am the Keir Starmer of radio.
Straight to the point.
If they're prepared to shoot each other to get on a boat, I don't know if they want them coming to this country.
Uncompromising.
They're incompetent.
Nick Ferrari at breakfast on LBC.
I've done a complete U-turn on this.
Listen on your radio and on Global Player.
Info.
Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
8:35. Greg Hans, Layla, Moran, Dan Hodges and Charlotte Proudman with me taking your calls. Well, here's a text question from Phil in Purley who says, if successful asylum seekers are being made homeless and don't like it, does the panel think they should F off back to France? Now, normally I wouldn't take a question with that kind of language, but I think we all know what that's referring to. But there's been a development today where refugee charities are warning that successful asylum seekers could end up homeless because the Home Office is now ordering them to leave the hotel rooms they've been put up in 7 days rather than the 28 days, which has been the case up to now. Charlotte, let's come to you first on this, because from a taxpayer point of view, you can quite see, well, the Home Office see that they can save a bit of money here. But on the other hand, I wonder how many people just in normal life find it easy to find a property to live in after 7 days.
No, it's impossible, isn't it? I think we all know that, how difficult it is to find somewhere to live. But if you're someone that's a successful asylum seeker, so has gone through the process of ultimately gaining refugee status, they're likely to have been through a hell of a lot. Who knows how they have arrived in this country, but I doubt it's been often by safe, secure means. Some people have had to resort to really dangerous mechanisms to get here. And then once they've gone through that process, which can take years, by the way, it's not just you arrive, you fill in a form, and then here you are, you have access to the UK, you've got successful asylum, you're given benefits, you're living a life of Riley. Far from it. I represented a young mother who came to this country as a result of, she herself had undergone FGM when she was very young, but she wanted to protect her daughter from female genital mutilation. I won't say what country she came from, so I wouldn't want her to identify herself or anybody else for that matter. And she had a horrendous time going through this, the Home Office. It took 3 years for the case to finally get to court. She had to undergo a medical examination to prove that she'd had FGM, which is incredibly invasive, as you can imagine. She suffered re-traumatisation as a result of looking at her genitalia and having it documented in this way. She couldn't access legal aid. She was living on absolute poverty, in really dire straits. Many working, not necessarily her, but others working on the black market for £1.50, £2 an hour. This really is modern slavery happening in this country with women who have children and are single mothers. And so when you talk about successful asylum seekers who are being made homeless and suggesting that they should F off, it just makes me question what the hell has happened to the state of our humanity when we are speaking to desperate people who are at risk of persecution in their home country, and we are here providing them hopefully with a safe haven to rebuild their lives, and we're telling them to F off back to France, which, by the way, isn't even their home country, instead of providing them with the accommodation that they need.
This is obviously referring back to Lee Anderson, the Deputy Chairman of the Conservative Party, who made the comment about, if they don't like living on the barge, they can F off back to France. It's a slightly different context to this.
It's worse, isn't it, here? Because what we're saying is that these individuals, these people who are often desperate, they are vulnerable, they've been traumatised by the system and the process and the risk of persecution back home, have actually gone through a legitimate, legal process, and they are met with a hostile environment, often by the Home Office. And what we're seeing here with this policy, in my view, is the nasty party is back. It's saying to these individuals who do need a roof over their head, otherwise, where are they going to sleep? They're going to be on the streets, aren't they? And they're going to be at further risk. Not only are they destitute, women will be at risk of prostitution, others will have no other mechanism to gain any access to resources other than modern slavery, and having to work, as I say, on the black market in these ways, and children even. Asylum seekers come here often with families. What on earth are they supposed to do?
Okay.
They're living on the streets, and what happens? And the local authority come along, and they put their children into foster care. Foster care can cost hundreds, sometimes £1,000 a week. So we're willing to put vulnerable refugees' children into hotels or bed and breakfast, or with foster carers, rather than actually putting them with their family in safe homes.
Well, it's a very interesting question, actually, because I've done a lot of these programmes, and normally these programmes are about, normally the questions in relation to sort of bogus asylum seekers, but this question specifically relates to somebody who is a legitimate asylum seeker, so it's a very easy question to answer. We need to be absolutely clear and unequivocal about this. Where we have a situation where somebody has been through the process and has been granted asylum, then we have an absolute and unequivocal obligation to provide them with sanctuary from persecution. And obviously, as part of that, if we're throwing them out on the street, we're not doing that. So I think in relation to the specifics of the question, it's very clear. We have to provide proper support and proper sanctuary to those who reach our shores and who we deem to be legitimate refugees. And that's not that's not a new policy. That's a policy that we've had in this country for decades, if going back further. But equally, I'm going to be honest. What you said was very, very articulate and passionate. But I'll answer your question. What does it say about us? The reason why we know the reason why that question was asked in that way, and it's because there are a significant number of people who reach this country who are genuinely seeking asylum. And there are a significant number of people who reach this country who are not generally seeking asylum but are economic migrants. And I think I think we have to be honest about this. We can all do our very sort of liberal, take our liberal perspectives on this. The reality is a lot of people are very concerned about the fact that there are large numbers of people coming here who are using the asylum system as a way of as an alternate route to economic migration. And I know we all hate it, and we're all very nice liberals who live in London, etc. But
we've got a nice liberal who lives in Oxford here.
Nice liberals who live in Oxford. But no. But we have to be. We have to. It's no good us going on programmes like this and throwing our hands up in the air and saying, "Oh, why are we all not being more humane about this?" That doesn't solve the problem. We have to address the problem.
Right. Let's move on to Layla.
There is a problem of people reaching our shores who are not seeking asylum, who are not do not actually require asylum, and we have to deal with that. Otherwise, we won't deal with the broader issue.
Layla Moran.
So first of all, the vast majority of people who do go through the system, by the Home Office's own figures, are genuine asylum seekers. It just takes a huge amount of time to process them, and actually some of the problems we're seeing is down to complete Home Office and government failure to tackle any of that backlog. So, I think we've got again, sense of proportion. We're into that today. The sense of proportion is that the vast majority of people do actually end up in this position where they get their papers, and it is not an easy process. Not as much as Charlotte, I'm sure, but I've also supported people through this. It is incredibly arduous, very, very difficult. So to get that paper saying, yes, you can be in this country legally, hurrah, and we have celebrated with many families as they've done it. The idea that they've then got 7 days to find somewhere anywhere in my area is just a complete nonsense. And all that happens at that point, and that point about councils, we were talking about councils. Councils are already under a huge financial strain, whether they're going under or not. None of them have any spare cash. And there is an act, which the Conservatives sometimes are very proud of, called the Homelessness Reduction Act. There is now a legal duty on councils to prevent homelessness. So all that's going to happen here is that they're going to be shunted out of these hotels and fall right into the lap of local authorities. You've mentioned what happens to the children, but also let's just talk about the cost of it. It's now the cost is going to get shunted onto local councils who already can't afford it in the first place. Wouldn't it be better? Use those 28 days as they are, have a better system, deal with the backlog, have a proper plan for where they go afterwards, have the children in a school where they can immediately go, help them get into work so they start contributing to the tax coffers, which they haven't been able to do because asylum seekers aren't allowed to work. Liberal Democrats think they should, because actually while they're here, why not? And then they're contributing as well. So there are a huge number of ways you can solve this, and I'm afraid that this is, one department shunting onto another. I do wonder what Michael Gove has to say about this in his position as Minister for Local Government.
We haven't got Michael Gove here.
No, I know, it's going to be his problem.
Greg Hands.
Well, look, I think I agree with Dan that actually it's a question about getting a balanced and proportionate response. The UK, we're very proud of our record over many decades of taking refugees from around the world. We've probably taken overall more per head than any other major Western country in recent decades, and we can be proud of that record as being a beacon where people come to. But we also have to be fair on taxpayers and have to be fair on people. The amount that we are paying at the moment for hotel accommodation is about £6 million a day. £6 million a day for hotel accommodation. That is not a system that is working well. So we need to make sure that we, if you like, solve the problem at source by reducing the number of people who shouldn't be coming here, particularly the number of people coming illegally into this country. And that is exactly what the government's programme has been doing with the Illegal Migration Act, which has been passed, which the Liberals and Labour have fought tooth and nail at every stage. But we are having some effect. The number of small boat arrivals this year is down 20% on last year's. It's still way too high, but we are taking action.
Is it really?
It is down 20%
if you look at the figures coming through August, they're pretty massive.
It's down 20% a year ago, compared to a year ago. I admit it's still too high, but it is coming down. We've reduced the number of arrivals from Albania, which a year ago was the biggest source of people coming to this country, which is not a country with persecution. I was in Albania myself on holiday about 3 weeks ago. It's not a country with persecution. The number of people arriving from Albania,
sex trafficking victims from Albania. I've represented those in blood feuds at risk of their lives who have been forcibly impregnated. There are people that are at risk of persecution in Albania.
That balance right, continue to be the beacon that Britain has always been, whilst being fair on tax.
It's broken.
A £6 million a day
system.
Hotel bill.
I don't know how you can defend it and prop it up in that way.
How can it be a beacon when your deputy, Lee Anderson, made this F-off comment? What did you say to him after that? Did you...
I
can't imagine that you supported that.
No, I said to him, actually, it was inappropriate to use swearing in this context and in relation to that particular issue, or indeed to any issue. I don't believe.
Did he then tell you to F off?
I don't believe. No, he didn't, actually. I don't believe in using swearing in any context, I'll be quite frank with you. So I would say to any of my deputies, if they used a word like that, that is inappropriate to use in any broadcasting format.
So why did Number 10 back him up then?
Well, did Number 10 back him up?
Yes, they did. Well, they sent out a cabinet minister, Alex Chalk, on all the different... He was on LBC, he was on the BBC, saying, well, yes, his point of view represents a lot of people in this country, and therefore he was entitled to make that point.
Well, I was clear that it was not the right thing to use a language like the F word in a public forum like that.
OK. Right. We'll move on in just a moment. Thank you very much indeed. Alex Chalk, my colleague, tells me, described the language as robust and salty on LBC. I think we can probably all agree that it was both of those things and a little bit more. It's 8:48.
LBC, Nick Ferrari at breakfast.
1 year ago, the reputation of the nation's biggest police force lay in tatters. You can't look me in the eye and say there's not another Wayne Couzens in the force.
I can't look you in the eye and say that we haven't got officers who are treating women appallingly. Absolutely not.
Sir Mark Rowley was willing to step forward to lead the Met into a new era.
I speak to a lot of frontline men and women, and they're really fed up.
Now it's your chance to put your questions to the Met Commissioner when Call the Commissioner returns with me, Nick Ferrari, exclusively here on LBC, Friday morning from 7.
Nick Ferrari at breakfast. Back tomorrow morning from 7. Listen on your radio and on Global Player. LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
It's 8:51 on LBC. Let's go to our next question, and it'll be answered by Greg Hands, Layla Moran, Dan Hodges and Charlotte Proudman. It's from Ken in Ilchester in Somerset. Hello, Ken.
Hello, brilliant show. What I would say is there's 50 million been donated by a healthcare company to the Tory party today.
How much?
50 million.
I think it's 5 million.
Oh, is it 5 million? Oh, sorry. Well,
it's a bit of a
5 million.
difference.
Should they
Greg's
there
face
is
is
a
fallen.
difference. Yeah, but there's still a lot of money
50
anyway.
million in the coffers there.
Yeah, all right. It's 5 million. Well, shouldn't they redirect that money to the people who have had to pay for healthcare that the Tories have underfunded for the last 13 years?
Greg Hands. It is 5 million, not 50 million. Isn't
I believe it's 5 million. Well, all donations to all political parties are made in accordance with the law and are declared properly, and that is quite right. And people can see transparently who funds the Conservative Party, who funds the Liberal Democrats, who funds Labour, and I think that is entirely proper. And we have declared, or will declare, the donation in the usual way, in the proper way, and so people can see it at face value.
What do you think a private healthcare entrepreneur wants in return for that donation? Because a lot of our listeners accuse the government of wanting to privatise the health service, and they say, well, the Tory party's in hock to private healthcare companies. And on the face of it, you can understand why they would say this with this kind of donation.
Well, look, I mean, I think that, to be fair, I think there have been private healthcare donors or people involved in private healthcare to all the political parties in this country. I don't assume that because somebody is involved in a particular business, as it happens, I don't think I've met the individual in question, so I don't know his motivations for giving to the Conservative Party.
You haven't even said thank you.
Well, it's... I think in terms of why people give money to political parties, you're assuming, or the questioner is assuming, that it's somehow related to their business activity. That is not always the case. It may be somebody who is actually involved in business. Many business people don't like the idea of there being a Labour government or a future Labour Lib Dem coalition, and therefore give money to the Conservative Party.
Is it an individual or a company?
It's an individual that's given it.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, it doesn't look good, does it? Because I think your question's exactly right, Ian. Why are they deciding to spend this much money?
Let's face it, your party have had a few issues on this type of thing in the past as well.
But on the NHS, I think Somerset's a lovely part of the country, by the way. We've had a new Somerset MP this week, Sarah Dyke.
Gratuitous.
Absolutely. No, she's wonderful. And I spent the door knocking in Somerset was stunning.
We're near the end of the programme.
On the doors, top of that list was they could not get a GP appointment for love nor money, and they were seriously worried about the NHS. The point, the caller, I think, is the wider point, is people look at the Conservative Party, they're looking at the NHS, they're looking at the size of donation, and they're maybe 2 and 2 is 5, or maybe not.
Right. If we can have brief answers from both of you, we can squeeze in one more question. Charlotte.
Can I agree with you? I think you should consider running as an MP. Should do it. I think it's a great policy.
Nobody's ever said that to a cross-question caller before. Dan?
I can't believe we're still having this debate. We have it every year. It's ridiculous. We should have state funding of political parties, but people don't want state funding, so we'll have this system. People will give money to parties in their own interests, not in the national interest. But if that's the system we want, that's the system we'll have.
OK, Ken, thank you very much. Next question, it's a text question from Wayne in Skegness. Isn't it refreshing to hear an MP speaking up about the issues men face in modern society and wanting to do something about it? Now, this is Conservative MP Nick Fletcher. He's called for the creation of a Minister for Men to address issues like male suicide, paternity rights and misogyny. We're going to be talking about this for the entire next hour. Unfortunately, Nick Fletcher can't join us because he's got something else on, but I'm sure we'll make the best of it. Now, Charlotte, there is a Minister for Women. Why shouldn't there be a Minister for Men?
Well, I think it's interesting that it's Nick Fletcher MP that's come up with this proposal, because you might remember back in, I think it was 2021 now, he suggested that having a female Doctor Who was resulting in crime going up.
I do remember that.
I think we actually may have even spoken about that. I mean, look, we have more male MPs than we do women, and very often those men that are sitting...
Not if you're Labour.
Well, across the board, Across the board, you do still, sadly. And when it comes to developing policies, it's largely, I'm afraid to say, white privileged men that are still creating those policies, and it's often from their perspective rather than from women's viewpoints.
But to be serious here, there is an issue about male suicide, isn't there? Particularly among young men. So why shouldn't there be a minister looking after men's interests as well as one looking after women's interests?
Largely, when we're thinking about mental health policy, it is from the perspective of men. It is often gendered in that way. It doesn't include the perspective of women, which still remain, unfortunately, are largely oppressed, even though they're a majority within our population. And so that's why we have a women's minister to address and, redress some of those gender inequalities across the board, looking at all policies. So yes, I think it's important to address the rise in misogyny, address violence against women and girls starting in schools, going through to universities, going through to the workplace, rising rates of rape and sexual assault. It's not just a women's issue, it's also a men's issue. It's largely men that perpetrate that, but not exclusively. So of course, but I don't think we need a men's minister to do that.
Dan?
Yeah, I'm quite surprised about that, actually. I mean, we hear about the culture wars, and I think there's a perception the culture war tends to come from the right rather than the left. I mean, I generally don't see what I don't see what the problem is. I mean, the statistics are there in relation to male suicide. There are particular issues that affect men, affect boys. I think if we have those issues addressed in an effective way, everybody benefits from that, men and women. I don't actually see what the problem is.
30 seconds each, if I may, Layla.
I think, actually, the core of what he's talking about, particularly misogyny, young boys, a lot of parents and teachers very worried about the effect of various online influences on young men at the moment. We clearly do have a problem, and there is a mental health crisis in this country, particularly in our children. Rather than this, because the fact is, the answer to the question is, yes, there's a women's minister, and the men's ministers are all the other ministers, because that has been the perspective that has pervaded Parliament for a very long time, and we need a champion for those issues. But we need cabinet-level mental health minister. That's what I would prefer. And I think we need relationship and sex education in schools all the way up to 18, so that actually boys and girls, men and women, get equal treatment.
Greg?
Yes.
Well, it's very, very serious issues being raised here, and I undoubtedly think that there are issues that affect men as much or sometimes more than women, like, for example, suicide, as you rightly pointed out. However, we already have a minister for women and equality, and we have a whole team. It's actually not right to say that they're all women. In fact, Mike Freer is a minister for equality working in Kemi Badenoch's team. There is a whole team. They answer questions in the House of Commons once every 5 weeks as well, and they are available to question, and those include men in that team. So Kemi is in charge of that team, which is of both men and women.
Can I just say, very briefly, on the point about suicide rates, of course, it's a serious issue. It's one that needs to be addressed. But when you look at the high rates of female suicides, a good number of those, and we don't exactly know how many because it's very difficult to count, stem from domestic abuse perpetrated by men
that is true,
women.
but when the biggest killer of men under 45 is suicide, I think it's an issue that does need to be taken very seriously.
It is, but across the board.
Let's lighten the mood a bit with our fun question from Benny in Cardiff. The Rolling Stones are back with a new album. Andrew Marr was getting very excited about this earlier. Which legendary act, living or dead, would you love to see making a comeback next? Layla.
I hate questions like this because
I've given you 10 minutes.
I know he did. He gave us a plan. Actually, you know what? I'm listening to a lot of Whitney Houston at the moment. You did say dead, and what a legend, and what I wouldn't give to see her in concert because I'm old enough now.
Didn't we almost have it all, Greg?
Well, I'm a massive fan of Duran Duran, who do still tour, so that can't be my answer.
This was not an answer I was expecting.
I would say, actually, I'm going to give the honest answer, which is not maybe a trendy answer. I would actually say, which would get the most public interest, would be the Beatles coming back Obviously, if I'm correct, 2 of them are still alive. But Reunite, I think, would have the biggest public interest. I think millions of people.
Well, I would have said ABBA, but of course they have made a comeback.
That's what I was going to say.
I'd actually say Oasis. Let's get the whole Noel Liam psychodrama dealt with. Let's park it once and for all.
But let's just all go back to the 90s. Let's just go and stay there.
Charlotte.
I was going to say ABBA, Freddie Mercury.
Oh, yeah, Queen. Yes.
Well, Queen do obviously still exist. Well, thank you very much indeed for that. Greg Hans, Layla, Moran, Dan Hodges and Dr. Charlotte Proudman. Coming up on Monday's panel will be, this is a juicy one, Emily Thornberry, sorry I've called you juicy Emily, Sarah Vine, Jonathan Gullis MP, and David Aronovich. You won't want to miss that one, I can assure you. But coming up in a moment, we are going to talk about the subject of a Minister for Men. Do we really need one?